The sunflowers were taller than I expected. That was the first thing I noticed, standing at the edge of the northeast corner in the dark before sunrise on September 2nd, 1953. Not the road, not the dust, not the silence of a farm that had gone 29 days without a single piece of good news. I noticed the height. They had come up past my shoulder over the course of that hot August, and now, in the last gray minutes before dawn, they stood in rows like something that had decided, on its own, to survive. I had been awake since 3. There was no point pretending otherwise. The bank's notice was dated August 4th. I had read the relevant line so many times, I no longer needed the paper in my hand. The demonstration of solvency or ability to service the outstanding obligation must be presented to this office no later than close of business, September 2nd, 1953. Close of business meant 5 o'clock. It was now, by the sound of the roosters beginning somewhere to the south, somewhere around 5:15 in the morning. 11 hours and 45 minutes. I stood at the field's edge with Rue sitting against my left boot, her ear cocked toward the road the way she always did when she was listening for something she hadn't heard yet. The dirt road that came in from the farm-to-market highway was empty. 6 miles of red clay running east from Winters, and there was nothing on it. No headlights, no dust plume, no sound except the dry creak of the stalks, moving in the first breath of morning air. I had asked about sunflower prices at Dillard's Feed and Supply 6 weeks ago. I had tried to ask casually, the way you ask about something that doesn't matter. The man behind the counter had looked at me the way most men looked at me that August, measuring the age in my face, finding it insufficient for the question I was asking. I don't know if he remembered the conversation. I had been counting on the fact that people talk. If no one came today, the farm went to the bank. If the bank got it, it would go to Clyde Rupp at $18 an acre, and the 41 years my grandfather worked this ground would dissolve into the edge of a larger operation that would never once think about what the northeast corner could hold if you planted the right thing into it. I wasn't going to let that happen. I had spent 29 days making sure I had done everything a person could do. But it was September 2nd, and the road was empty, and the sunflowers were taller than I expected, and I had 11 hours left. I want to tell you how I got here. All of it, from the beginning. The notebook, the old woman with the seed, the man from the bank who said my grandfather's name like it cost him something. It starts 30 days ago, and it starts with a letter I wasn't ready to read. The letter came on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had been up since before light fixing the drag harrow, and Tuesdays were when I let the hens out an hour early to work the east side of the yard, and I remember hearing the rooster and thinking I had more time before the heat came on full. I was wrong about that too. The envelope was white, which should have meant nothing, but it had First Agricultural Bank of Coleman printed across the upper left corner in a typeface that looked like it had been designed to communicate permanence. I read it standing at the mailbox. I read it twice. The balance was $1,840. The deadline was 30 days from the date of the notice. 30 days from August 4th, 1953. After that, the property would be subject to foreclosure proceedings. I folded the letter exactly the way it had been folded, slid it back into the envelope, and walked to the barn. He arrived about 20 minutes later, a gray Ford sedan, well-maintained, pulling up the dirt road in the kind of deliberate way that announces a man who has made this drive before and does not enjoy it. He was 54 years old, square-shouldered, wearing a hat he kept on when he got out of the car. He introduced himself with his full name and his title and the name of the bank. He handed me a copy of the same letter I had already read. He did not ask how I was managing. He did not remark on the heat, which was considerable. He said that the bank understood the circumstances of the inheritance and wished to give me every opportunity to demonstrate the farm's solvency within the period specified. He said the 30 days. I said I understood. He got back in the gray Ford and drove out the way he came, and before the dust from his tires had settled back onto the road, another vehicle turned in from the county road. This one was a pickup, older, dark green, with a long crack running across the lower half of the windshield like a river on a map. The man inside was 62 years old and had been farming the 210 acres to my south for longer than I had been alive. He leaned out the window and told me he was sorry about what was happening. He told me he'd been watching the place and thinking about the situation. He told me he was prepared to make an offer, $18 an acre, and that given the mortgage and the state of things, I might find it the most sensible path forward. He said it kindly, the way men say things when they believe they are being kind and are not. I told him I'd think about it. He nodded and waited for something more. I didn't give it to him. I walked back to the barn, lifted the bucket of oats off the hook, and went to feed Hector. Hector ate slowly, the way he always did, working through the oats without hurry, and I stood there in the barn letting the quiet come back around me. That was something I had learned in the first 2 weeks, that the barn had its own silence, different from the silence of the house, and that if I stood still long enough inside it, I could think more clearly than I could anywhere else. After a while, I walked out into the field. What was left of the cotton was nothing. The plants had come up in late April looking reasonable enough. Then the frost came through on the 14th of May and took the new growth, and by June, the root rot had found what the frost had missed. I'd pulled the stalks myself in July, before Granddad passed, the two of us working opposite rows, and when we were done, the ground had looked like something scraped clean. It still did. 88 acres of red clay loam baking under a Texas August, the color of old brick, cracked at the surface in the low spots where the moisture had gone out of it fastest. 6 miles east of Winters, give or take, sycamore branch dry as chalk along the property's east edge. I walked the northeast corner, the quarter that had always been the hardest to work. Cotton had given up on it before I was old enough to drive the tractor. The soil there ran heavier, thicker, and in a wet year, it would puddle, and stay puddled long after the rest of the field had dried. In a dry year like this one, it set up almost like adobe. I crouched and broke a clod with my thumb. The color beneath the surface crust was darker. There was something still holding down there. I didn't know what to do with that thought yet, so I carried it back to the barn. I went into the tack room looking for a harness strap. The left side trace on Hector's work collar had started to cut, and I wanted to wrap it before it got worse. The tack room was narrow, maybe 8 feet by 10, and it smelled like neat's foot oil and old leather and the specific dry dust that collects in small rooms that nobody thinks to sweep. I found the strap on the second hook. And then, because I was turning to leave and the afternoon light came through the single small window at an angle I hadn't seen before, I noticed the nail. It was a cut nail, the old square kind, driven into the stud just above eye level, and on it hung a small notebook. I had been in that tack room 100 times, more than 100. I had never seen it. The cover was dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners, about the size of a man's hand. I lifted it off the nail and stood there holding it, and the afternoon went very quiet. I didn't open it right away. That's the part I keep coming back to when I think about those 2 days. I stood there in the tack room with the notebook in my hand, and the light was doing what it had been doing, and the smell of the room was what it was, and I set it in my coat pocket and finished wrapping Hector's trace, and went and fed the hens, and came back inside and made supper. I set it on the kitchen table while I ate. I looked at it the way you look at something you're not sure you're ready for. I opened it after dark. The handwriting was small and careful, the kind that comes from a man who learned to write when paper was scarce and you didn't waste the page. The ink had gone brown in places. The first several pages were soil notes, column after column of dates and depths and moisture readings, the numbers precise down to the quarter inch. He had been taking soil samples in this county since at least 1937. Reading it was like listening to someone think out loud, quietly, over years. I read until the lamp needed refilling. Then I went to bed and lay there for a long time. The next morning, I started again from the first page and went slower. He had tried sorghum on the South Field in 1938. Notes on why it failed. Drainage, mostly. He had tried a cover crop of winter vetch along Sycamore Branch in 1940 and written 2 pages about what it did to the soil the following spring. He was not a man who repeated mistakes. He was a man who wrote everything down so that he wouldn't have to. I reached the sunflower page on the second afternoon. It was dated September 1941. 1 full page, written in 2 sessions. You could tell because the ink changed shade partway through, like he'd come back the next day to finish the thought. He had planted a single test row of oilseed sunflowers on the northeast corner of the property, the quarter that had always been the hardest ground, the red clay that cotton gave up on before I was born. He had tracked it for 12 weeks, yield per acre, 890 pounds of seed. He had written that number twice, once in the column and once at the bottom of the page, underlined. 890 pounds, on the worst quarter of the farm. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, Rue was moving through the dry grass along the fence line, her nose working at something I couldn't see. The afternoon was still and hot and smelled like red dirt and distance. He had known. He had written it down in September of 1941, and then the war came, and cotton prices held, and the notebook went on the nail, and nobody opened that door at the right angle of light until now. I turned the page to see what else he'd left me. The next page was blank. Not damaged, not torn, just blank. He'd left it empty, and I didn't know if that meant he ran out of intention or ran out of time. I closed the notebook and set it on the workbench, and stood there in the tack room for a while with my hands at my sides, listening to the way the barn breathed in the heat. I knew where I needed to go. There was a woman who farmed north of us, 2.1 miles up the county road, on a small piece that had been in her family since before the First World War. She was 71 years old, and she had buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and she still kept a kitchen garden that put everyone else's to shame. I had known her my whole life. She used to bring Granddad a jar of sorghum at Christmas, and they would sit on the porch and talk in that slow way old people talk when they are not actually talking about what they are talking about. I drove up her road just after 4 o'clock, when the light had gone amber and long. Her truck was parked beside the house with 1 flat tire and a bird's nest in the side mirror. I knocked on the screen door and she came to it in a flour-dusted apron and looked at me the way she always had, like she was measuring something behind my eyes. I told her what I'd found in the notebook. I told her about the northeast corner, about the yield figures, about the underlined number. I didn't tell her about the bank or the deadline. I just told her what the notebook said. She didn't say a word. She turned from the door and walked through the kitchen toward the back of the house, and I understood I was meant to follow. We went out the rear door and across 20 yards of packed dirt to a low mound in the ground with a wood-framed door set into it at an angle, the root cellar. She pulled the door up by its rope handle, and the cold earth smell came up from the dark like something that had been held in a long time. She went down the steps without a lantern. I heard her moving around in the dark, and after a moment she came back up carrying a burlap sack with both hands, the way you carry something that matters. 40 pounds of oilseed sunflower seed, saved since 1947. She set it in my arms and I felt the weight of it shift and settle. I tried to pay her. I had folded $11 into my shirt pocket that morning for exactly this purpose. She shook her head once and looked past me at the road. I stood there, holding 40 pounds of someone else's patience, and I didn't know yet what it would cost me to be worthy of it. I thanked her and put the sack in the truck bed and drove south into the dust of my own making. I got home just before noon and set the sack in the barn out of the sun. Then I walked the northeast corner again, the 4th time that week, and stood in the middle of it trying to see what my grandfather had seen in 1941 when he decided this ground was worth testing. The soil up here was redder than the rest of the farm, heavier. Cotton had quit on it by 1948, and nobody had planted a thing since. 12 years of Johnson grass and shinnery oak seedlings, and the slow, patient work of nothing growing where something should. I pulled up a handful of soil and pressed it in my palm, and it held its shape the way clay does, the way a fist does. I started on a Wednesday, August 5th. The Ford 9N was running right since I'd welded the axle sleeve, and I put the drag harrow on it and went into that northeast corner before first light, working by feel until the sky went gray enough to see the rows I was cutting. The heat came up fast each morning. By 7, it was already wrong. By 9, it was something you worked inside of rather than against, a kind of pressure you stopped noticing only because you had no choice. 4 days, I made 8 passes with the harrow on each of the 4 cardinal directions, and then ran the plow down the worst clots and harrowed again. My hands blistered on the 2nd day, and the blisters broke on the 3rd, and by the 4th morning, I had stopped looking at them. The mule stood in his pen and watched me with the long patience of something that has seen a great deal of foolishness and learned not to comment. On the 3rd day, I drove into Winters to ask about prices. Dillard's Feed and Supply smelled of grain dust and motor oil, and the particular staleness of a room where men have argued the same arguments for 30 years. The counterman was a heavy-set fellow with a pencil behind one ear. I asked him what sunflower seed was bringing per hundredweight. He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, but the kind a man produces when something confirms what he already suspected. And he called back to the stockroom where another man was working, and he repeated my question loudly enough to make sure it carried. The laughter came back from the stockroom in a brief sound, like something dropped. I wrote the number down in my own notebook anyway. $4, maybe $4.10, depending on oil content. I thanked him and left. Word moves in a small county the way water moves through clay. Not fast, but it gets there. 2 days later, I was pulling the harrow along the fence line when I heard a truck slow on the road. I didn't look up right away. I heard the window come down. "Sunflowers are a weed crop," the voice said. "You'll be gone by October." I kept driving. The voice from the truck window was still in my ears 2 days later when I walked the northeast corner for the last time before planting. August had arrived like something you'd been warned about, the heat sitting on the land like a second sky. No wind, the red clay cracked at the surface into shapes like old pottery. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against it. 6 inches down, where the drag harrow had broken it open, the soil was different, cooler. There was still something in it. I thought about the page in the notebook. 890 pounds per acre, worst quarter of the farm. The old man had written it down in pencil, neat and unhurried, like a man reporting a fact he expected someone else to need someday. Friday, August 14th. I was up before first light. The seed broadcaster was a hand-crank model, iron, painted green once, now mostly rust-colored at the joints. I'd oiled it 3 nights before and run it empty to check the spread pattern. I loaded the first batch from Mrs. Phelps's cotton sacks. The seed was dark gray, flat-faced, heavier than I expected, and I walked the first row as the sun came over the tree line to the east and turned the clay the color of a brick. Rue walked every row with me. She didn't need to. She had no job in that field, but she walked at my left heel, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her side against my knee on the turns, and she never once went ahead. 14 acres is not a large number when you say it. It is a very large number when you are walking it with a hand broadcaster and the temperature is climbing past 90 before 8 o'clock. I walked until the rows blurred. I walked until I stopped thinking about Clyde Rupp and his voice through the truck window and Mr. Taft's letter folded in the kitchen drawer, and I thought only about the spread, the overlap, the coverage. Keep it even. The old man had written that too, in the margin. Even coverage is everything in broadcast seating. Walk slow. I walked slow. I finished in the last hour of light. My shoulders ached in the specific way they do when a muscle has been used past its memory of work. I sat on the fence rail and looked at the 14 acres and tried to see what my grandfather had seen in 1941. Some quality in that ground that made him write it down, that made him keep the notebook, that made him hang it on that nail instead of burning it with the other papers. I didn't say anything to anyone about what I did next. 2 days later, I drove to Coleman alone. I had the timber survey in an envelope on the seat beside me. The western woodlot, 14 acres of post oak and cedar, not prime, but standing. I had looked up the pulpwood broker's name in the county extension records. He had an office above a hardware store on Walnut Street. I came home with a check for $1,352. I deposited it the following morning and told no one. The sunflowers broke ground on day 12. I almost missed it. I was coming back from checking the fence line along Sycamore Branch, and the light was low and amber, the way it gets in late afternoon in August, and I looked over at the northeast corner, and there was something different about the color of the soil. I walked out there and crouched down, and there they were, 100, maybe 200 small paired leaves, translucent and pale green, pushing up through the red clay in rows that were almost straight. Almost. I had walked slow with that broadcaster, but I am 18 years old and not a surveyor. I stayed there a while, crouched in the dirt with Rue sitting beside me, and I thought about my grandfather making this same walk in 1941, checking this same ground for the same thing. He would have been 41 years old then. I tried to imagine what 41 looks like from the inside. I could not. On the morning of August 19th, day 15, I was in the barn repacking the front wheel bearing on the Ford when I heard a car on the road. I recognized the sound before I saw it. A 1951 Buick, dark green, moving at the careful speed of a man who is deciding something. Mr. Elroy Taft parked at the gate. He did not come to the barn. He walked directly out to the northeast corner, the long way around the fence, and I stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. He was a large man, and he moved slowly, the way men his age do in August heat. He walked the first row and then the second. He bent down once. He straightened up and stood there for a while with his hands at his sides. He did not wave me over. He walked back to the car at the same pace he had walked out. He paused at the gate and looked in my direction. I don't know if he could see me in the shadow of the barn, and said something I almost couldn't hear across that distance. Your grandfather was a careful man. Then he got in the Buick and drove back toward the county road. I stood in the doorway until the dust settled. Then I walked out to the northeast corner myself and stood where he had stood and looked at the rows of first true leaves, small and upright in the red soil. He had not extended the deadline. He had not said anything that changed a single number or a single date. He had driven 6 miles out from Coleman, walked 2 rows of a boy's sunflower field in the August heat, said 8 words, and driven back. I stood there a long time. Rue sat at my feet. The leaves did not move. The air was completely still. I counted what I had, 15 days in, 14 days left. The next 5 days moved differently than any before them. I had stopped measuring time in what needed doing and started measuring it in what was actually happening, which is a different kind of counting entirely. The sunflowers grew faster than the notebook had led me to expect. Granddad's 1941 notes described the seedling stage as slow, 8 to 10 days before the first true leaves showed confidence, he'd written, and I'd taken that as a warning about patience. But the August heat was doing something to that red clay I hadn't anticipated. The northeast corner held morning moisture longer than the rest of the farm, the way a creek-adjacent quarter sometimes does, even when the creek itself is dry, and by day 18, the stalks had cleared my knee. By day 20, they were waist-high. Not all of them. The rows were uneven the way any hand broadcast planting will be, but enough of them, and thick enough in the stem, that standing at the edge of the field and looking north, you saw something that did not belong on this particular farm in this particular summer. Something green that had no business being there. Clyde Rupp drove past twice that week. Both times he slowed, neither time he stopped. I watched him from the tractor seat both times and did not wave. He did not wave either. Mrs. Phelps came on Sunday. She walked the rows with her hands behind her back, the same way Taft had walked them, though slower and with more attention. She stopped near the eastern edge of the planting and crouched down, slower than she wanted to, I could tell, and looked at the undersides of 2 leaves. She called me over without raising her voice. The leaves on a section of maybe 30-40 plants had gone a pale yellow-green between the veins, while the veins themselves stayed dark. I had noticed the color was off, but had not placed it. She placed it immediately. Iron chlorosis, she said. The pH was locking the iron out of the plant. She had seen it in her own garden in '49. She told me what to do. I drove into Winters the next morning, day 21, and bought ferrous sulfate at Dillard's, mixed it dilute the way she said, and applied it by hand with a watering can across that section over 2 mornings. It was slow work. It was the kind of work nobody would ever see or credit. But by day 23, the new growth on those plants was coming in the right color, and I walked that section twice and counted roughly 2 acres that would not lose yield now that might have. 14 days had been. 9 remained. 9 days. I wrote that number in the margin of the notebook on the evening of day 23, and then I looked at it for a while before I closed the cover. The heads had begun to form by then. Not all at once. It moved across the 14 acres in a slow wave, starting at the south end where the soil drained fastest, and working north toward the dry creek. By day 25, they were heavy enough that the tallest stalks had begun to lean slightly east, pulled by the weight of their own faces. I walked the rows that morning and pressed my thumb gently against the back of one head and felt it resist, firm and dense, the way a full head is supposed to feel. The seed was setting. That much was true. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table with the lantern and a piece of paper and did the arithmetic for the 4th or 5th time, hoping the numbers had changed. They hadn't. The timber money was $1,352. That was fixed, signed, the check already deposited at the county bank in Coleman and applied partially against the note. What remained of the $1,840 balance was $488. To clear it entirely, I needed the sunflower contract to reach $488 or better. At 14 acres and roughly 850 pounds per acre, which is what the soil looked capable of, maybe slightly less, I had to be honest with myself, I was looking at somewhere near 11,900 pounds of seed. At $4.10 per hundredweight, which was the price I'd heard quoted in general terms at Dillard's 6 weeks earlier, when I'd asked, and the man behind the counter had looked at me sideways, that came to roughly $488. The number fit. Barely, and only if the yield held, and only if the price held, and only if someone actually came. And no one had come. I had asked about sunflower prices at a feed store. I had not spoken to a buyer. I had no contract, no name, no handshake. I had a field of heavy-headed plants that nobody in this county grew commercially, and 4 days before a bank deadline, and a phone I didn't know who to call. I blew out the lantern and sat in the dark for a while. Rue was on the floor near the stove. I could hear her breathing. Outside, the wind had come up from the southwest, the way it does late in August, and I could hear the heads out in the field moving, a dry, papery sound, like the turning of pages. I let myself think about what losing looked like. The land going to Clyde Rupp at $18 an acre, Hector going to whoever wanted a 14-year-old mule. I thought about it for a long time. Then I went to bed. Day 28. Day 28. I fried 2 eggs in the cast iron pan and ate them standing at the stove because I hadn't bothered to pull out a chair. The bread was going hard at the edges. I ate that too. Rue watched me from beneath the table with her chin flat on the floorboards, the way she did when she was monitoring something she didn't fully understand. I rinsed the plate and set it in the rack and looked out the window above the sink at the last of the evening light going orange across the field. The heads were down, heavy and full, facing east the way they do when the seeds are ripe, the way they stop tracking and go still. It was a good-looking field. That was the true thing. Whatever else was true. I had planted it on ground my grandfather's notebook said would hold, in a dry summer, with saved seed from a neighbor's root cellar, using a tractor I had welded back together with my own hands. And it had grown. The field had done its part. That was something the land couldn't take back from me, even if the bank did. I went out after supper to check on Hector. He was standing quiet in the near corner of the paddock, one hip dropped, ears relaxed. I leaned on the fence rail, and he came over slow and let me put my hand on his neck. He was warm from the day's heat still, and I could feel the big muscle move under my palm when he shifted his weight. 14 years old. He had worked this ground before I was grown enough to hold a lead rope. I scratched behind his ear for a while, and he closed his eyes. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. That was the exact truth of it. I did not know. But I had decided something, quietly, somewhere in the past 2 weeks, and standing there with my hand on Hector's neck, I felt it settle into place like a gate latch going home. I would not sell this land to Clyde Rupp. Not at $18 an acre. Not at any price. If the bank took it, the bank took it, and that was a grief I would carry. But I would not hand it to a man who had offered to help me fail. There are things you do for money, and things you do not do regardless of the money, and that line was where I stood. I went back inside just before 9 o'clock. The stars were out by then, the Milky Way pale and wide overhead. I sat on the porch steps long enough to find the one I always look for first, low above the south pasture. Then I went to bed. Wednesday came in quiet. I was up before the sky changed color, out of habit more than intention. I fed the hens, I pumped water for Hector, and stood in the barn door with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching the eastern edge of the pasture turn from gray to copper. The sunflowers were just visible from there, the heads heavy, the stalks dark against the pale field. 29 days since Elroy Taft had put that notice in my hand. I had counted them each morning, the way you count the last of something. He came at mid-morning, a green 1950 Dodge pickup, cleaner than anything that usually came down this road. He drove slow, like a man reading the land as he went, and pulled to a stop at the gate without being told to. He got out and looked at the northeast corner for a long moment before he looked at me. We talked some. He walked the rows, crouching twice to lift a sunflower head in both hands, turning it in the light. He didn't say much while he looked. When he came back, he pulled a clipboard from the truck, and we worked out the numbers on the hood. 11,900 pounds estimated, at $4.10 per hundredweight. He wrote the contract out in pencil first, then ink. I read every line. The total sat there in black, enough, when added to what the timber sale had already put in the bank, to clear the full $1,840 and leave $312 beyond it. I signed it on the hood of his truck, in the same field where my grandfather's charts said the soil would hold. When the Dodge turned back down the road, I stood there until the dust settled. Then I walked to the barn. I took the notebook down from its nail. The leather was warm from the sun coming through the high window. I held it for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight of it. 4 inches by 6, worn smooth at the corners, 12 years older than I was. Then I hung it back where I'd found it, on the cut nail in the tack room wall. I went and fed Hector. If you've got a barn nobody's opened in 20 years, open it. If there's a notebook on a nail, read it. The old ones didn't write things down for themselves, they already knew. They wrote it for whoever came after. That was me. Maybe it's you. If any of this felt familiar, leave a comment and subscribe. I'll be here.